So this is joint work with Ashim Pesaran here at USC. And here we are trying to provide the first reliable quantitative assessment of 40 years of sanctions on the Iranian economy. There is a lot of material we cover. I'll try to synthesize the best I can in 20 minutes. So the tension between Iran and the US started after the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran in February 1979. In November 1979, there was the famous Iran hostage crisis, Tehran hostage crisis, where 55 US diplomats and citizens were held hostage for more than a year until President Reagan came about in January 1981. Now, since then, the tension between Iran and the US, and not only the US, and to some extent the whole Western world, have been quite serious. However, it's unclear to what extent the Iranian economy has suffered just from sanctions or also from a series of mismanagement policies that the new Islamic government has implemented since the 1980s. Now, in order to answer the question of how bad sanctions have affected Iran over a 40-year lifespan, we had to introduce a couple of innovations in terms of methodology. This is because the literature typically tends to consider, the literature on policy evaluation and program evaluation tends to consider cases where there is a simple switch between a policy on, policy off, or vice versa, policy off, policy on, and does not account for the variability of the intensity of a given policy over time, which is exactly the case of Iran, because over 40 years of time, sanctions have not been held at the same level of intensity throughout the years. So what we do is to build, for the first time, a sanction intensity indicator. We will build on the strategy of Baker, Bloom, and Davis through newspaper coverage, and I will back that up theoretically in terms of what explains the goodness of such a strategy. And then we will identify, so we will pose a new framework in order to give estimates of a direct causal link between sanctions and the Iranian performance. We will perform structural VARs to establish the channels through which sanctions may or may have not influenced the Iranian economy. And we will go also with reduced form equations, which is a subset that is possible to implement in this framework in order to evaluate not only the economic impact, but also the socio-demographic one. Now, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview about the Iranian economy, because I'm sure not everyone has a clear idea of that on top of their mind. I don't know how much I will be able to go into that, but here I'm showing a couple of features. One is that the Iranian oil exports have been affected by sanctions. So the level of, this is quantity, these are thousands of barrels per day. The quantity of Iranian oil exports that were there in 1979 have, before the revolution and the sanctions, have not been matched again in history since then. The first major drop happened because of the Carter administration embargo following the Tehran hostage crisis, after which there were 8 years of massive war between Iran and Iraq. At the time, Saddam Hussein ended up attacking Iran, after which it kind of recovered. These were years of moderation in the Iranian political cycle, until Ahmadinejad came about in 2005, raising concerns about uranium enrichment programs, which induced the Western powers to implement higher sanctions again. In 2015, there was the JCPOA, so the UN and Iran managed to find agreements on limiting uranium enrichment program, which improved also the exports. And then here it's when Trump came about. However, the important thing is that since the sanctions were implemented for the first time when oil exports accounted for 95% of the overall exports, Iran has implemented a series of strategies in order to reduce its dependence on oil, and now it's barely 50% of the total. So there has been a shift. One important thing that will come up to be important is the foreign exchange policy. Now, here you see the official foreign exchange, which is subsidized and does not reflect the true market strength of the Iranian currency. It's something that the Iranian government has done for 40 years in order to help the provision of basic goods. And you see the true black market, free market exchange rate in blue. And you can see that even though the Iranian government has repeatedly tried to keep this rate subsidized for a long period of time, then it undergoes massive depreciation and exchange rate crisis from time to time when that position is no longer possible to maintain. And you see that eventually these two rates track each other. But the most important thing is that such an endemic problem as inflation for the Iranian economy seems to be indeed highly correlated with the foreign exchange movements. I want to jump into the core of the model because of the whole methodology, because I know I don't have much time. Now, let me explain first why we use a newspaper indicator, why it is a good idea, and then I will go to the methodology and the results. Now, as I was explaining before, the sanctions on Iran have been characterized by a prolonged nature, more than 40 years, with a time-varying intensity. This is important. Now, here we will focus on 6 major newspapers that will catch the extent to which these sanctions were or were not implemented. We try to blend the more European and American side and both the more economic and general type of press. So we have the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, and the Financial Times. We will build 2 different sanctions indicators. One which tries to capture when sanctions were imposed, sanctions on for brevity, for short, and sanctions off when sanctions were released. And then we will build a single indicator that subtracts the 2. Now, why is this a good idea? Well, because this is a classic latent variable problem, where the true sanction process is, of course, unobservable at time t. According to the newspaper that is reporting the news, you have a different factor loading on your newspaper, which is going to be represented by theta j, plus a certain error that, of course, may depend on anything. Now, this is going to be the number of news that is going to be reported by newspaper J on day D of month T. Now, by virtues of the law of large numbers, what happens when you have 6 newspapers over 30 days in a given month is that by averaging them out, which is what I show here, you can show that the idiosyncratic errors move extremely fast asymptotically to 0. You have 156 data points for each month, which pushes the little o, the OP very, very fast to 0, which helps to have a reliable estimator of the true sanction process by virtue of the newspaper coverage. Of course, the more newspapers you have, the more precise your estimates become. So once we build these 2 indicators with newspaper coverage, sanctions on and sanctions off, we try to understand, okay, what's the net effect of sanctions, the overall strength of sanctions intensity. We apply a grid search in order to find the right weight at which sanctions off should be removed by sanctions on. It turns out to be 0.4. It doesn't really matter. The episodes of sanctions off for Iran have been extremely limited, mostly focused on the 2016-2018 period, after the negotiations in Vienna and before Trump came about. Now, we also do some sort of external validity test. For a subset of this period from 2006 onwards, there is an official list of US Treasury entries of the number of Iranian entities that are sanctioned and on which sanctions have been levied. It's not a great measure because it's a bit granular. It's a bit, it happens to have a lot of bunching, but the correlation is still pretty high. It's still 0.4% almost. Now, let me show you the index, because the index captures all the major shocks pretty well. By the way, here I'm going to focus, we decided to focus from 1989 on to avoid confounding effects from the war, because otherwise it was easy to claim that the first 8 years of war with Iraq would have been confounding. Between me and you, we did a bunch of robustness checks, it didn't change anything, but to avoid cheap shots, we focused on the period from 1989 on. So you see that the first period was the period of moderation in the Iranian politics. It didn't really happen to have major shocks. There were a couple of implementation by the Clinton administration, but nothing massive. After Ahmadinejad came about, however, the pressure on Iran has increased by a lot. It's interesting to notice that the peak was not reached under Trump in terms of pressure on Iran, but under Obama. And this is explained because Obama managed to push the whole war basically to sanction on Iran. So there was a coordination between UN, US, EU, and Australia, Canada, other major countries. So they all managed to force the Iranian administration to come to the table, which eventually was successful because the JCPOA entered in full effect. So for a couple of years, Iran was levied their sanctions before sanctions were reintroduced with the strategy by Bolton and Trump of maximum pressure. So that's pretty much the behavior. If you have questions after, I can enter a little bit more into that. Now let me show you why we need a different theoretical methodology, because the two main approaches used in the literature are the synthetic control method and the panel data approach. Now there is a problem with both methods. Problem number one is that there is a clear-cut sanctions policy on, policy off type of approach, which is not the case for Iran, because Iran has gone through 40 years of different intensity in terms of the sanctions imposed. So for example, the panel data approach first used by Shao and others had, as an example, as an application, the handover of Hong Kong from England to China, from the Great Britain to China. And that's clear-cut. 1997, clear-cut policy episode 01. And that's a perfect case where you can implement a PDA. Now, that's not the case for Iran. Number two, not only the intensity varies over time, therefore you don't have a clear 0-1 switch. These methods need a donor pool of countries and a clear set of pre-treatment trend, which is not the case of Iran, because the moment in which sanctions were imposed in 1979 coincides with the moment in which the Islamic Revolution came about, and therefore there is a structural change in the regime, which has nothing to do with sanctions per se. So the pre-trend 1979 data are not necessarily useful to understand what happened later, because it's not the same administration that at some point, the same regime that at some point decided to change policy. It's a completely different country, you can think of it. Okay, so how do we go about it? Okay. So we build a fully general model. So I'll show you first in a single equation, then I will switch to a multivariate setting. So assume that there is a certain variable. For simplicity, we will consider output growth. So this is changing logs of output, which depends on the country fixed effect, the past behavior of country growth itself, sanctions at time t minus 1. I didn't have the time, but the sanction processes can be proved to be AR1 in our data. You have some country control variables, wherever you want to use, typically oil price is a major variable for a country like Iran, and a bunch of unobserved factors, which are global factors plus a shock. Now, what happens is that you don't know you don't know how the rest of the world enters into the specification of the Iranian economy. So what you can do is to build a model for the rest of the world. So every other country of the world can be mapped by their country fixed effect, their specific country variables, and the global factors, such that according to the loadings, it's the model itself that establishes which is the relevant country that affects or may affect the Iranian economy, rather than specifying an arbitrary donor pool of countries and having an algorithm spitting out the weights. Now you can stack these variables for the rest of the world together. You have a matrix form, you average them out. The weights in our case are not going to be 1/n. It doesn't make sense. There is a country like the US, which should not be weighted as much as a country like Canada. So of course, they are GDP weighted. And to the extent that these error terms are weakly cross-correlated, which is always the case in practice, you can invert the matrix of factor loadings, of global factor loadings, and have an expression for FT. Now, this is great because if you manage to have a closed form expression for this, you can plug it back in your equation for Iranian outcomes, which is what we have eventually. So we have a closed form solution, which we can bring to the data and estimate given the asymptotic behavior of the errors. Now, how do we use this framework in our analysis? Well, we first build a structural bar where we have foreign exchange rate, money supply, inflation, and output. Now, money supply is not going to matter much, but the causal link will be also based on the evidence that I gave you before, from the exchange rate that depreciate first as a financial variable, affecting inflation, as I showed you before, which eventually affects the output growth. We have a bunch of control variables to capture the global factors. So we have the oil price returns, we have the global output growth, we have the global equity returns, the change in the global long-term interest rates, the global realized volatility, and the global real exchange rate returns. You can put more, but results have been so incredibly stable and so incredibly robust that at some point we just stopped. Okay, so of course this is a structural bar. So the structure of the matrix is the one that basically I mentioned before. It's going to be a lower triangular matrix that I showed you before. Let me go to the results. Now, what do you see here? Here I'm showing the results without all the controls. I can show you all the controls. It doesn't change much. They are always non-significant. Now, what happens is something quite interesting. Let's focus on the foreign exchange rate first. Here it's a foreign exchange rate expressed as Iranian rials for US dollars. So if this variable goes up, the Iranian rial is depreciating and the US dollar is appreciating. Vice versa, if this variable goes down, it's the Iran rial which is appreciating and the dollar which is depreciating. Now, when sanctions are imposed, there is a massive depreciation that happens to the Iranian rial USD exchange rate. Now, these numbers have to be multiplied by the median of the sanctions, and these are quarterly data. When you do that, this is almost 20% per year, which is massive. However, if you look at the effect 1 quarter later, this is a typical case of overshooting. So partially, the exchange rate reverts back. If you take the difference between the two, this is still more than 10% per year of depreciation on sanctions as a direct effect. You can see some very marginal effect of global output growth. Of course, there is a dependence with respect to the past behavior of the foreign exchange rate, but then nothing else really matters. And I can show you the results also for global controls. Money supply growth doesn't matter at all. We didn't even have this in the first case. Then we had some comments, why don't you put money supply growth? You can see that sanctions don't affect money supply growth, nor money supply growth seems to affect anything for the Iranian economy. The only thing that explains money supply growth is money supply growth lagged of one period itself. More interesting dynamics happen for inflation. Now here it's true that sanctions seem to affect inflation to some extent with a lag, but these effects are extremely tiny. Now this is no more than a 1 or 2 percentage point per year, which is nothing considering the 18-19% of average inflation that the Iranian economy goes through. There is some indirect effect of sanctions through exchange rate affecting inflation, but to a large extent, I will show you that inflation is an endemic Iranian problem, which has nothing to do with sanctions. It has to do with policy mismanagement for the most part. With respect to output, on the other hand, of course, the sanctions do not affect output in the very same quarter. It would be too much, but with 1 quarter effect, there is already a sizable direct impact of sanctions on Iranian output growth. Now this, when you bring it to a quantitative estimation, it is sizable. It's almost 3% per year, 2-3% per year according to the specification you want to use, according to the number of controls you want to use. And considering that the Iranian economy grew from 1989 to 2020, so over a 30-year period at an average of 3.1% per year, this is almost like 2-3% of misgrowth per year. So it's a really sizable effect, no matter how much you try to choke this coefficient. And you see a negative effect of the foreign exchange rate, but then this has to be considered also in light of the direct effect of sanctions themselves. Now there seems to be these sort of dynamics which are therefore quite interesting. So what we did is to consider some impulse response functions and some foreign exchange variance decomposition. Now here you can see that the effect of one standard error shock of sanctions to foreign exchange is very sizable on the implementation. So this is almost 5% per quarter on implementation, but it dies out very quickly. This is the overshooting reasoning that I was highlighting before. So you can see that after 1 quarter, the effect is already gone. Now with inflation, also because of sticky prices, things take much longer to be washed out. This is 4 years period, but the effects are tiny. This is like 0.4% per quarter. So this is nothing with respect to what are the levels of inflation in Iran. So don't consider this in US or European terms. And finally, the output growth effect, it's sizable and long lasting. So here there's a loss of 0.4 per quarter. The effect starts to become much milder after 1 year, but still it takes forever to have them dying away. Now, when it's the foreign exchange that is shocked, of course, the effect on foreign exchange itself is very, very sizable. But once again, you see how fast exchange rates go back to normal, while the effect on inflation is sizable and it takes forever to die. This is 2-year period and there are still effects going on, while there is basically no effect on output growth. Now, if we shock inflation, it has no predictive power on foreign exchange because, as I showed you before, the causal link goes all the way around, goes from foreign exchange to inflation. So a shock to inflation doesn't change anything in terms of foreign exchange rates. Of course, it affects inflation once again, and it has some mild effect on output growth. Although this is not something that at this point matters anymore for the Iranian economy.
Dario,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt or interject.
Yes.
I mean, you have, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes, I mean, to
Yes.
conclude, because we may not have a lot of discussions. I mean, that's why I'm giving you more time than is actually required. So you have 5 minutes, and then we have 5 minutes for anybody who has questions or
all right.
Comments. Please go ahead.
Let me just show you the forecast error variance decomposition and some highlights of the sociodemographic results that we have. Now, in terms of foreign exchange, you can see that sanctions don't really matter beyond 16% to explain in terms of quarters ahead, what is the variance of the foreign exchange. Now, what really matters is all the unexplained part of the foreign exchange itself. However, what is really relevant, and here it's the most counterintuitive results, is that the direct effect of sanctions themselves on output growth doesn't matter that much. There's a huge unexplained part which is given by policy mismanagement, explains even after 2 years up to 85%. So sanctions, the direct effect of sanctions is not able to explain more than 5%. So there are serious mismanagement problems with the Iranian economy that do not relate necessarily to the imposition of sanctions, even though the effect is sizable. We implement a lot of other tests to see the effects on sectoral output growth, because Iran has changed its output structure in terms of value added. So it has shifted away from manufacturing to agriculture. Believe it or not, it went all the way around because it was easier to export. The most interesting aspect, however, maybe it's the gender bias. So the effects on the employment rate are there. So there is a sizable effect of output of employment losses following the implementation of sanctions. However, there is a massive difference between males and females exactly because of the Iranian mismanagement policies in handling with sanctions. So the output, the employment losses for males are quite mild. These numbers are very small, but when you look at women, not only it gets stronger, but it gets 10 times as big. So there is a massive hit for women, for Iranian women, following the implementation of sanctions, even if sanctions are not aimed to have a gender bias. We see that there are no effects on primary schools, and this is an effect of Iranian authorities trying to maintain a level of primary education reasonably good, but there's a massive effect both on middle schools and on high schools. And once again, female students seem to be hit much harder than males in terms of student participation. That's pretty much it. Thank you for your time. I think I did it in 4 minutes, and of course, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any comments, questions?
I have not read the paper, but I think the first, I think the body showed that the adjusted R square is very low. For example, except with the inflation, all the adjusted R square are either 0.04, 0.24, 0.13. So the explanatory power is not that great. Yeah.
No, I mean, here you have 24%. I wouldn't call this to be low. Money supply doesn't matter. So for us, it's perfectly fine to have an adjusted R squared, which is so low. We didn't even want this in the first place. We added for completeness. So this is normal, not to matter. But this R squared is pretty high.
Yeah, that is the fine. Yeah, but this output growth also, that's why I think you were seeing many unexplained part in the output growth. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a macroeconomic regression. So of course, this goes back to what I was saying before, that 85% of the forecast error variance decomposition is still not explained by anything else than past output growth itself. So of course, you have to consider this in a macro setting. Now, how do you go and measure policy mismanagement in case it's policy mismanaged? Well, that's very hard. In my opinion, 13-20% of R squared for a macro regression is not low. I would agree that this is low, like less than 5%, but I think this does a reasonably good job, actually.
I see. Okay.
Okay. Dario,
go ahead, Zhiyi.
Okay. So Dario, so usually I think the structural war, usually we don't, because there can involve a lot of variables and multiple lag periods, right? So usually I think we don't really look into the those single coefficients. We just look at the impulse responses. I think that will be like a more clear to present your results. And the other is what is your like identification strategy to identify those the shocks? So do you mean like the shocks is just the foreign exchange shock and the inflation shock and the or TFP shock? What is
no, the identification strategy is given exactly by the type of setting that I showed you before. So here we build basically a latent factor structure. So to the extent that these shocks basically on sanctions do not relate to any other country except Iran itself, and they are totally uncorrelated to what happens to factor shocks. So that's a key assumption which helps basically responds to our identification problem. To the extent that this sanction shock have nothing to do with the factor structure of the world, then the sanction shock itself gets identified. And
so my understanding is that the factors only to generate the dynamic, it's not to identify the shocks. So the shocks, do you mean like you have a Shadowsky identification, you have a sequence of the...
I have better than that. I have a general impulse response function.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Dario, when we measure the impact with the use of newspaper coverage of the sanctions, wouldn't it be better, I mean, to measure both growth and internal impact using maybe some data from either the Iranian government or some data from, let's say, the whoever, the World Bank or whoever keeps data on the movement or the direction of some of the numbers, in which case, how does newspaper coverage essentially measure impact on the economy? I mean,
the sanction itself, the sanction indicator itself does not measure the impact. It only measures the extent to which there is a heightening of the sanction process on Iran. So it's not the impact that is measured, but only how intense sanctions are getting in terms of pressure. Okay, so you have to consider that almost as a thermometer. So it just measures to what extent the temperature is going up or is going down. It doesn't measure what is the effect of that on, I don't know, the life of the animals or how hot or cold I feel. So the sanctions itself, it's only a measure of how much pressure, international pressure or US pressure, wherever it is, there is on Iran. Now, we use then the whole framework that I was discussing in order to discuss the impact. But the sanctions itself is not, it does not measure the impact. Now, here I do have something more, quote unquote, hard in terms of data, if that's what you're looking for. Here I'm normalizing and I'm measuring the SDN. This is the US Treasury entry, and this took a huge amount of work. It ends up being in a tiny note of the appendix, but this is a huge amount of work that I did in order to measure each single entry in each single PDF of Iranian entities, individuals, and vessels that the US has sanctions over the last, well, it was 40 years. No, this is from 2006, 15 years.
Yeah, and before we run out of time, another thing I wanted to ask, I mean, because looking at your paper, you seem to indicate that the loss of growth by Iran was 2% per year, whereas it would have been 5% previously, or it was also 5% for the countries, some of the countries around Iran, in which case indicating maybe, if I hope I didn't misinterpret, that 2% decline in Iranian GDP growth wasn't really that significant, which I probably will agree if we also include the fact that obviously there was substantial mismanagement and all that stuff. But what is your conclusion in terms of the impact of the sanctions on Iranian
most
growth?
likely? No, it's a good question. Of course, one can discuss what is a lot, what is not a lot. So yeah, that 2-3% just tells you that if sanctions were not there, Iran would have grown pretty much the same rate as the other major developing countries, growing at 5-6%. Now the problem is that what this paper shows is that even if that can seem like a lot, there is a ton of other problems that relate to the Iranian economy. So even if you end up levying sanctions, since they have been so ingrained with rent-seeking behavior of all type of sorts, potentially what you have is only a spike in terms of improvements of the overall Iranian position, and possibly that effect is going to wash out quite quickly. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran is not going to benefit from levying sanctions, but to the extent that it doesn't solve problems that relate to, for example, inflation, that are not driven by sanctions, but to lack of depth of capital markets, lack of depth of money markets, complete problems with non-performing loans on the bank balance sheets. Well, that effect is going to wash out. Eventually, more fundamental forces related only to the Iranian case and its administrations is going to matter in the long run.
Thank you so much. God bless you. And
I will stop sharing.
We appreciate the thought-provoking analysis. Now somebody else is supposed to be chair at this point, but let's go back to Dr. Das.
It's a joint paper with Dr. Partha Ray. He was my colleague, and he is now director of National Institute of Bank Management. The title of our paper is "Does Latin America Save Less?" What are the reasons that we are doing an empirical investigation based on specifically the macro data. So now we all know that savings occupies a key role in economic growth and development. In the Herodian model, the savings can boost up growth. Solo says that it has implications for transitional dynamics, and endogenous growth models, we know that higher savings give a higher permanent growth. And but we found that interestingly, unlike Asia, Latin America is low saver, and in recent times, the savings rate is lower than sub-Saharan Africa. And now, why is this? Is it explained by the economic factors, or there are some cultural factors? Because some of the studies point to that cultural factors which are behind but we didn't get the data for cultural factors. So we are going to, like my co-author, he has sent his presentation. He wanted to do the presentation, so I'm sharing the presentation part of it, and I will be there for question and answers. So okay. Can you see it, or?
Yes, I believe I'm seeing it. Does everybody else see it? If you don't see it, please say so.
oh, something went wrong. Let me see. Sorry about that. I'll do that.
Yeah, otherwise we'll have some administration guy around, maybe she.
No, I'll do it quickly. Just 1 second.
Sure.
So something. Can you see it?
Sure can.
Okay.
Yes.
Good afternoon, good evening, depending on which time zone you are. My name is Bertram. I'm talking from this western Indian city called Pune. Me and my co-author, Sibabrata, who is from IMF.
Professor Amin, are you part of this presentation?
Yes.
Oh, he is?
No.
Yeah. Initial interest on savings.
Wait a minute. Let me just make sure what's going on here. Professor Das, you're raising your
other geographies.
No, basically what happened, like it is midnight there, so he just recorded the presentation.
Oh, he recorded it.
He is my co-author actually.
Solo, even an endogenous
also, okay, so he is doing it instead of you.
Permanent growth.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, I'm sorry.
Would have some distributional effect. Now, interestingly, if we look at the empirics, Latin American economies are low savers. And when we were doing this paper, both Das and me were surprised to find out that even in comparison with sub-Saharan Africa, Latin American are low savers. Why? Is it beyond economic factors? Do the standard economic variables like per capita income, demographic variables, low interest rate, even inflation rate could tell the story, or cultural factors like hedonism, presence of hedonism could play some role. It's this which prompted us to do this paper. This is not fully on Latin American, all the countries. This looks at 6 bigger economies of Latin America, namely Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Our notable absent country is Argentina.
What happened?
Which we consciously avoided because of too many crises happening there, and therefore the story that we wanted to tell was perhaps not valid in case of Argentina. And what we find, economic factors along with demography and education could explain the low savings of Latin American countries. Moving further, the plan of the paper is we'll look at some stylized facts, very brief literature survey, I can skip it. We'll look at the data and empirical strategy. We'll look at the econometric results and some concluding observation and future agenda. In terms of empirical, of course, there are 2 strands of literature, the Fisherian savings in the intertemporal model, the rate of time preference as a major determinant, and of course, there are Keynesian consumption function, where savings primarily is a function of income. We all know the famous empirical study of Kuznets, which looked at long-run stability of the savings from US. And later on, researchers like permanent income hypothesis, like Friedman, or life cycle hypothesis, like Modigli. And then the major work came from what's called the Euler equation approach of Robert Hall, which dominated the empirical work, which looked at lag income, lag consumption. Of course, the evidence is mixed, and income often turned out to be having very low predictive power. The other interesting paper we found is the Flavin 81, which looked at consumption smoothing is not sufficiently observed, but it possibly responds excessively to income. As we already said, this basic stylized facts is the global share of Latin American countries has hovered around 8% of global GDP, and therefore there's criticality, given the criticality that was already established in terms of determining the long-term growth rate. We found out that Latin American countries are often seen as low savers. And as we said earlier, their savings rate could be even lower than savings rate of sub-Saharan Africa. Now this tells the story in numbers. In 2019, Brazil, with a per capita GDP of around $9,000, has a gross national savings of 12.7%, as against India with a per capita savings of around GDP of around USD 2,000, has a savings rate of something like around 30%. Do the standard variables explain such a wide difference? This paper looks at some of these questions. And if you look at this table in particular, this is clear that at least for the last 10 years of 2010 to 2019, Latin American and the Caribbean savings rate of 18% was lower than sub-Saharan Africa savings rate of 19%. And whereas emerging markets and other developing countries is something like 32%, and particularly in terms of developing Asia, Asia minus few countries which are Asian developed countries like Hong Kong, like Macau, Japan, Korea. If you now Singapore, we do not take into those countries into account, they save as much as 40%. Now, our sample is much focused. We look at, as we already said, the 6 countries of Latin America. Their share in the Latin American group is something like around 75%. So they are Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. And of course, we are not looking at some other major Latin American countries. Either they are small or more so because there are too many crises there, like Argentina and Venezuela fall in that category. Next few slides will just tell you the broad stylized facts that we got to see. One general theme we get to see here is growth definitely suffered after 2007 in most of these countries, so has savings rate. So after 2007, 8, 9 global financial crisis, both growth and savings suffered here. Of course, age dependency, like any other emerging markets, have shown a steady decline, showing that younger generation are much more. Remittances play a role. Interestingly, remittances had a roller coaster dive in terms of crisis in these economies. Moving further, interest rate, there are in terms of, at least in terms of real and nominal interest rate, the story could be different, but given the high inflation rate in many of these countries. Let me take you through the basic data and variable. So in some sense, the study is essentially empirical. We do not have a theory. We have certain theoretical bases, certain theoretical explanations behind these variables. So first, the basic dependent variable is private savings GDP ratio. Then in terms of the determinants, we look at the aggregate dependency ratio, or specifically we look at the old age dependency ratio. We look at share of urban population. We looked at per capita GDP, real per capita GDP, purchasing power parity. We look at public savings, bank credit GDP as sort of a proxy for financialization. Looked at terms of trade. Many of these countries are big commodity exporters. Consumer price inflation, real interest rate, remittances we've already talked of. We also looked at 2 more variables, namely the extent of human capital, which we have taken back from the Barrow-Lee data set of average years of schooling, age 25 plus, and we looked at the global financial crisis. This is essentially either the 2008-9 crisis or the Latin American crisis. We have looked at the crisis study as well. So we first, very mechanically, we run a country-specific regression, with respect to a very limited time span. Essentially, we looked at 1994 to 2019 for each of these countries separately. Given the smallness of database, smallness of time span, you need to, and given the yearly nature of the time series data, we need to take these results with a handful of salt. End of the day, it looks like most of these coefficients are of the right kind of the sign. Also, they're significant. R-square values are reasonable to impressive. DW in some cases low, and therefore there could be problems, serial correlations, and therefore we just looked at this essentially in terms of broad stylized facts of these economics. Moving forward, we looked at, so when you look at this country-specific regression results, we sort of see, excepting Brazil and Colombia, for all other countries, per capita income, the key economic variable has turned out to be insignificant. For all the countries, coefficient of public savings has been negative in significance, perhaps indicating the extent of some sort of responsibility, fiscal responsibility that many of these countries suffer from. Of course, old age dependency ratio have turned out to be consistently negative, and that's expected. Interest rates seem to have very little impact. Inflation is significant of all economies excepting Chile. Remittances are seen to have a positive influence, and of course, human capital coefficients varied across the countries. So then we moved to a panel setup. We treated them as a panel and essentially looked at the standard panel regression technique. When you look at that, the very basic one, kind of a fixed effect estimation, we looked at it. These are kind of right kind of a signs. The aggregate, the ADR old ratio is negative. You get expected. Even log of real GDP per capita PPP is significant. Even very, very rightly so, the terms of trade is positive significant. Even the rate of interest and others, including remittances, are fine. The only insignificant variable that we found essentially is the human capital index that we have constructed. But if there could be some elements of some problems with the standard fixed effect estimation, therefore we have taken panel GMM, the EGLS estimation, and there we found that even the ADR, and that's somewhat rocky, as well as remittances and the human capital, these three variables found to be insignificant. So what we arrive at, the broad conclusions, despite the limitations of these particular the database as well as the empirical results, we found per capita GDP, urbanization, terms of trade, inflation, and remittances, they positively affect savings, whereas old age dependency ratio, public savings, and real interest rate, they do negatively, and these are to some extent robust, but we have already pointed out with respect to GMM, there are some issues. So to sum it up, end of the day, it is essentially the private savings. There are pull variables and there are push variables. The standard economic variables play a major role indeed, but there are less traditional variables like terms of trade and extent of human capital formation. These results are somewhat true for individual countries. They seem to indicate, our results seem to indicate there is some element of commonality of savings behavior along these countries that can be explained by a set of variables. Let's conclude. Low savings rate of Latin America has often sort of found to be riddle in terms of the preliminary evidence, but we found that the lion's share of this behavior can be explained through set of economic and demographic variables. Goes without saying, this is a work in progress. So moving forward, what we need to see other variables that could look at. We could possibly look at the crisis and trust factor in financial system. You know, Cavallo and others in this book have argued very forcefully that lack of trust would be a major determinant of low Latin American savings. Low financial literacy, language use, inertia, and lack of attention that has been emphasized in literature, whether we could capture them in terms of a formal story. These are our further research. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll to move to Mr. Das if you have any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, he wanted to present, but it is late at night in his place. So I thought that would be on the way to record the presentation and then. But we actually, in addition to those regressions, we ran, say, like we did the unit root test and we did some other regression results we couldn't put because this is the work in progress. And I am busy, tied up with the annual meeting at the World Bank IMF. So we thought any questions will be welcome. And as we said, that it is a work in progress and we are working on that.
Does anybody, any member of?
Yeah, I should be the discussant. May I share my screen?
You want to ask some questions or you want to make some comments?
I'm the discussant.
Here's the discussion to you.
So may I share my, I have some slides for discussant.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, so thank Dr. Das and Dr. Rai's presentation. So
thank you.
So first, the overview of the paper. So this is an empirical paper. The paper investigates the determinants of the savings rates in Latin American countries. So the empirical model is like that. The savings rate is the savings to GDP ratio, and we engage in this X is a vector of many determinant explanatory variables. And we run the panel regression on the Latin American countries. We control for the fixed effect. And the conclusion is the results show a set of economic and demographic variables can explain most of the Latin American savings rate, right? So a few comments. First, the comment is what is the goal of the study? So is that study attempted to explain the level of the interest rate or the movement of the interest rate? So the level of the interest, so the empirical method seems to investigate the movement. So we still have we want to match the movement can be explained by the movement of these independent variables. And we include the country fixed effect, but we think about that. If we think about, we want to explain the difference of the level of the savings rate across countries, then these fixed effects actually reflect the unexplained cross-country differences in savings rate. So my suggestion is, so suppose if we can just based on our estimates in these empirical models, then we normalize those values of these explanatory variables. So we compare how much differences can be explained, and probably they can give us some idea whether this level difference truly can be explained by the difference in these variables. The other thing is actually this is a historical decomposition is a concept in the a VAR analysis, right? So this can help us to understand how much of the movements can be explained by the movement of these explanatory variables. And since we know there's actually the Dario's presentation remind me about that. So since the savings rate is a kind of endogenous to the policies, so the monetary policy will respond, economic policy will respond to the changes in the GDP growth, inflation, and these and the savings rate will respond to these changes. So it's kind of endogenous. So if you can have some theoretical framework and based on that have a structural like a VAR structure, then probably that can like improve your result. So this is one comment. The other one is selection of the variables. So here I know previously you have a paper about the savings rate in Asian countries. So in there, actually you include the GDP growth in the regression. But now probably you are concerned about the endogeneity because a high interest rate probably lead to a high high growth. So this is a kind of you cannot like disentangle the effect, causal effect, because they have mutual effects. But from the graph, actually, you can see the growth rate is actually have a pretty strong predictive power for the savings rate. So I think that's probably still can include some, because even like you have a causal effect of the savings rate on the long run growth. But for the business cycle, I think it should be fine. So the cyclic moment of the component of a GDP growth, you probably still can like include as a included in your empirical model. So that actually can help to improve your matching of the data. And another thing is I'm thinking like an interest rate is a kind of could be like in some sense arbitrarily determined by the central banks. But the other assets actually don't like absolutely determined by the real interest rate. So probably you can look at some other asset returns, like the average like returns on the capital in firms. And that will like have a better, that can better reflect the actual like a capital return in the economy. So in general, this is my comments. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I say something?
Yes, is this Mike?
Oh.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, I'll unmute myself. Are you giving the floor to me, Amin?
Well, who is?
Amin.
Amin, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That seems to be a very good paper in sense that it collects much data. The one thing that I would like to suggest or ask is this: whether you can break the savings into sources of savings, private, public, household savings, and all, to see which are the sources of savings. Secondly, you find out which are the factors affecting savings. What I was trying to notice that is, I didn't see something like how the institutions play a role in either mobilizing the savings or not. What is the role of institutions involved in the savings? Because the institutions are quite important. Because then I saw the C in your regression analysis, the C value was negative. I don't know how you interpret that. Because if you look at the total factor productivity and also looking at the role of institutions, whether how you can capture those two things. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment on the paper? Yes, I see somebody raising their hand.
Hi, I actually have just a question maybe. So I understand that you use the share of urban population to measure the emergence of middle class in America, in Latin America. Is that the only variable you tried for that? It seems to me that a big chunk of savings should come from middle class, and the fact that the middle class has been growing in Latin America should have some variance for that.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, I apologize, but I could not really, the presentation went too quick, so I missed what was the the relative share, the impact that terms of trade have. If you were willing to say just a little bit on that. It seems to me that most of Latin American countries are living off their exports mostly. So terms of trade should be a major component there.
Okay. Dr. Das, you want to comment on that? Or you
just...
Yeah.
First of all, Zhiyi, thank you very much for your comments, and please send me the PowerPoint which you presented. Sure. Yeah, and we did the structural BER, and we found a co-integrating relationship. But as I said, that is a work in progress, and thanks for the comments. We will incorporate all the comments and try to improve upon on those things. And the thing is that about the share of urban population, we included that, and then actually we did a graph, and we didn't include in the paper that this share of urban population and savings has a relationship where somewhere it is like increasing relationship, somewhere it is decreasing, declining relationship. So it is an ambiguous sign we got. Unlike there was another IMF working paper, Gigoli, they found always the negative impact on the share of urban population. So we are looking into it. And the institutional variables we wanted to include, but then all these problems with the government and institutional database. So we will look into it, and then where we will find the consistent database for all these countries, and we'll include those. And I think the especially that about the regression, we wanted to include the summary stats variables and summary statistics table. Plus, actually, we wanted to include the details about the GMM process and all the institutional variable like instruments we have used. But we will definitely improve upon this, and then this is a work in progress. And thank you very much for all the comments, and we'll work on it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Das. I mean, does anybody else have any comment on this? Otherwise, we go to the next paper we have, which is going to be presented by Dr. Zhiyi. Is that right? That's the paper on.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I can do that. Wait.
Interest rates lead to low economic growth. Is that what's the paper, right?
Okay, so I can present.
All right, go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me to present my work. So this project studies the relationship between the interest rates and the economic growth. In the past decade, after the Great Recession, the interest rate in the US has been set at a very low level persistently. Along with the low interest rate, we observed the decline in the long-run growth. In the literature of the business cycle and the monetary policy, usually the economic growth is exogenous, and the interest rate is the result of the market equilibrium. So in this regard, the low interest rate is a result of the low economic growth. But however, if we look at the interest rate and the GDP growth in the past decades in the US, then we will observe some interesting patterns. So in this graph, the red line shows the real interest rate, and the blue line shows the real GDP growth. So based on the relative level of interest rate and GDP growth, we can see three different sub-periods. So before 1980, the interest rate was significantly lower than the GDP growth. Between 1980 and 2000, the interest rate was fluctuating around the GDP growth. They are pretty close. After 2000, again, we see the interest rate was set like significantly lower than the GDP growth. Another thing is in these three different sub-periods, we observe the pattern of the economic growth. So that before 1980, it appears the economic growth, long-run economic growth, was trending down, and between 1980 and 2000, the growth was long-term growth was pretty stable. Then after 2000, again we see a decline in the potential growth, long-run growth. So to make if we isolate the long-run trend of the growth from those cyclical fluctuations of the business cycle, then this pattern will be more prominent. So in this graph, I use the HP filter to identify the long-run trend of the growth. So the dashed red line shows the long-run trend of the GDP growth in the US. And I use the excess rate, which is a difference between the real interest rate and the GDP growth, to measure the relative interest rate in the different monetary policy regimes. So from this graph, I want to stress 2 points. So first, it seems the monetary authority, in some sense, they have the power to set the interest rate, level of interest rate, independent of the economic growth. And from the graph, we also see there appears to be some relationship between the long-run growth and interest rate level. All right. So because of that, then I asked this question. So can monetary policy or interest rate have some real effect on the long-run economic growth? Of course, it's a question difficult to answer. So I try to find out some channel that can link the interest rate and the long-run growth. So here I pick the R&D expenditure as a variable that can link both. So first, there's a causal effect in the between R&D and the long-run growth. So in endogenous growth theory, the R&D is regarded as a significant contributor to the economic growth in the future. Economic growth. So it seems based on this theory, the R&D has a causal effect on the future growth rate. And there also a link between the R&D and the interest rate, because in the private sector, the R&D expenditure in the firms are voluntarily determined by the firms. And the firms, they invest in R&D for profit. They expect that the R&D will bring back some economic returns in the future. So I expect the private sector R&D expenditure should respond to the economic policies. So this second relationship will be the focus of this paper. So in this paper, I provide empirical evidence about the relationship between R&D and the interest rate in both aggregate level and firm level. And the empirical results shows in the aggregate level, the aggregate R&D expenditure will be lower, tend to be lower when the interest rate is low. And when we look at the firm level data, it appears the firms in different size groups will have different responses to the interest rate. And the pattern in the aggregate data is mainly driven by the large firms. So in large firms, when interest rate is high, they will increase their R&D expenditure. Okay, so it appears the empirical results suggest a low interest rate policy will lead to a low R&D expenditure in private sector. And if we believe in those endogenous growth theory, then the low R&D probably will lead to a low growth. So now, then I propose an explanation for the firm's R&D decision, why the behaviors are like that. Okay, so this is for this paper. So first, let's think about look at the empirical study. So before we get to the data and the specification, first I want to discuss about the relationship between interest rate and the growth rate. So I start from the standard Euler equation. So Euler equation tells us the agents will make the intertemporal decisions based on, say, this condition. The marginal utility of today's consumption should be equal to discounted marginal utility if I save and consume in tomorrow, right? So if we use the log utility, then the risk-free rate will be in this form, So will be 1 over beta times expected consumption growth. And in the steady state, then the interest rate will be 1 over beta times the output growth, because in the steady state, the consumption growth equals output growth. So that means in the high growth period, the interest rate should be higher, right? And so in some sense, it's true, like the interest rate will be affected by the growth rate. Besides, the business cycle will affect the interest rate too, right? We have in the good time, the interest rate should be higher, and in bad time, interest rate should be lower. In addition to the long run growth and business cycle, we know we have the central banks can have some arbitrary power to set the interest rate level. So there's another component that is determined by the central banks. In a New Keynesian model, we probably would call that monetary policy shocks. So we see there are 3 different components entangled in the interest rate. So I attempted to decompose these different effects in the interest rate. So we have the 3 effects: the effects of the monetary policy, the interest rate level. Then we have the long run growth. We have the effect of the business cycle. So to capture the monetary policy, this interest rate level, then I use excess rate instead of the interest rate. So excess rate is defined as the difference between interest rate and GDP growth. And for the, I use the potential GDP growth to capture the long run growth, and output gap to capture the business cycle effect of a business cycle. So in the empirical study, instead of using interest rate, I will use these components to capture different effects. Okay. Now let's. These are just the plots of the excess rate with interest rate and with output gap. So let's look at the data and the specification. So for the R&D data, I aggregated data. I used the data provided by NSF. NSF provide the R&D spending data by source of fund. So mainly the R&D is funded by government and business. I will focus on the business part. For the firm level data, I use the accounting data in CompuStat, and I focus on the non-financial firms. So in a firm, the income statement will report the R&D expense in the firm. For the regression, the dependent variable in the aggregate data, I use the ratio of R&D to GDP, so that I don't need to worry about the inflation or the size of the economy. For the firm level data, I use I think of it like two variables. One is about the ratio of R&D to invested capital. So this is the asset, the resource allocation in the firm to the R&D spending. The other is just a log level of the real R&D in the firms. And for the regression, it's for aggregate just the time series regression, and for the firm level data, I use this is a panel regression. So the key variables is still like 3 components in the interest rate. And most important is I just care about this excess rate that measures the monetary policy effect. Okay, and I control for some like a time trend, recession dummy, and a firm level fixed effect. All right, so first we look at the aggregate data. So in aggregate data, this is shows the like a total R&D spending and the government and the private sector. So the total R&D expenditure seems to be stationary over time, and in earlier time the government spending is dominate the R&D expenditure, but now afterwards the private sector contribute to majority of the R&D spending in the U.S. Okay, I will focus on the this industry or private sector. This table reports the empirical results, regression results. So in the column 1 and 2, I still use the real interest rate and the independent variables. Then in the next columns, I will decompose the interest rate to different components. But I just focus on these real interest rate or excess interest rate. So here we can see the coefficients are significant. All the coefficients are significant and positive. That means if you have a lower interest rate, the aggregate R&D expenditure tends to be lower. Okay. All right. So this is for the aggregate. Then we look at the firm level data. So this is my ComputeStat sample. So I calculate the weighted average R&D to invested capital ratio and versus the excess rate. And I know this is difficult to see the correlation, but the correlation is positive. So we think about the regressions. So here I run the regressions for different size groups for the firms, large firms and small firms, because they have a different behavior response to the interest rate. So in the small firms, they don't respond. The R&D allocation in small firms doesn't respond to interest rate. But in the large firms, they have a positive response. That means when your interest rate is high, the large firms tend to increase their allocation to the R&D activities. Okay. So in the ComputeStat data sample, we will see actually large firms contribute the majority of the R&D expenditure. So the top 25% large firms contribute more than 90% of the total R&D expenditure. The top 10% of firms, they contribute more than 80%. So I would like to check more detail in the large firms. So I think I divide the large firms into three subgroups and run the regression, run the same regression, and we see the result effect is robust. And for the large firms, actually the effect will be stronger, right? So for the top 10 large firms. But the problem is, since here we think about the R&D allocation. So this is the ratio of R&D to invested capital. So it could be it's not because I changed my R&D expenditure. It could be just the changes in the invested capital driven this drive this effect. So next I just use a level of log level of R&D expenditure in the firms. I also control for the firm level fixed effect. We see still we can see this effect. In the large, especially in the large firms, a higher interest rate still lead to an increase in the R&D expenditure in firms. Okay, so it's not just that because of the changes in the invested capital. So largely, the result shows actually the positive relationship between interest rate and the R&D expenditure in firms, especially in large firms, and there are heterogeneity across size groups. So I propose an explanation for this R&D behavior in the firms. So I will have like a three ingredients. So first, I will distinguish the different behaviors of long horizon and short horizon investments, and I will show like financial frictions actually that will create the heterogeneity across firm size, and the arbitrage transactions also can help to explain the behavior. So first, about the long horizon and short horizon investment. So I will think about this firm problem as asset allocation problem because the firms, they invest in R&D for profit. So this is a kind of you allocate your available resource between your current main business and R&D activities, right? They both should bring you like a positive economic returns in the future. So, but the returns, the pattern will be a little bit different because for the business, if you allocate the resource in the, say, start of the period, then you can get profit in the end of the period. It's pretty quick, right? It's horizon is short. But for R&D, you need to wait. You invest in the R&D, probably you need to wait several years to get a positive economic returns. So you need to wait. That is a long horizon investment. And we can think of the interest rate as the opportunity cost of these investment. So for the short horizon investment, the current short interest rate is its opportunity cost, right? So if we have a lower interest rate, then that means my opportunity cost is lower, then I should increase my investment. But for the long horizon investment, it's not that simple because I need to wait for multiple periods. And if we suppose in the business cycle, we will experience ups and downs. So on average, actually the average interest rate throughout the whole business cycle should be pretty stable. And the starting point does not matter that much. If I start at the good time, probably I have a higher interest rate, but in the end, the average rate still be very similar. So here, for simplicity, I just assume the changes in short rates will not affect the long rates for this long horizon investment, right? So then we start from the simple assumption. So we assume the credit market is complete. That means the firms can borrow unlimited money at the risk-free rate. Okay, so the marginal cost will be a constant because if you increase your borrowing, your interest rate will not go up. So in this case, in response to a decrease in the short rate, your short investment should increase because your marginal cost goes down, but your marginal return is actually greater than your marginal cost, you should increase your investment. But for the long investment, because we said it doesn't matter what is a short rate is, because for the whole period, I still have a pretty stable interest rate. So in this case, it will stay unchanged. And so in the complete market, the firm size does not matter, and the short rate. If short rate decrease, then the R&D allocation will decrease, but R&D spending will not change. Okay, so this is in the complete market. Then we consider we have an incomplete credit market. We have the default and we have a asymmetric information between the creditors and the borrowers. So now the firms face certain borrowing constraints. That means their leverage cannot exceed certain limit. And when they increase their leverage, their interest rate will go up because your default risk will go up, right? So you have a default risk premium. Now the size matters because the small firms actually they face tighter borrowing constraint and the steeper risk premium curve than the large firms. So here I just take this as given. I have another paper discuss about that, but here I just use the conclusion. So. And in this case, if we assume the monetary policy shock will be zero mean error, we have a monetary policy shock, but it's not biased. Then in response to a decrease in the short rate, then for the small firms, because their risk of premium curve is steeper, so it's very hard for them to extend their credit. They cannot increase their leverage, even the rate actually is lower. So in this case, your available resource will largely unchanged, and the allocation will be largely unchanged. But for the large firms, it's different. If we have a constant marginal cost, then you should expect that the short investment will increase and the long investment should be unchanged. But now, if you increase your short investment, you will increase your leverage. Increase your leverage will lead to a rising risk or premium. So even though the business cycle fluctuation does not matter for the long-term investment, but the risk of premium will increase the cost. This will be bared by the long-term investment, so that will actually increase the marginal cost for the long-run investment, and that will lead to a decrease in the R&D expenditure. Okay. So here we assume the monetary policy shock is unbiased. Now we relax the assumption for monetary policy shocks, and we allow it to be biased, so that the policy rate can be kept as persistently lower. And the long rate, in this case, the long rate can also be changed because the benchmark rate actually be lower, right? Then here, I would say the low interest rate will create arbitrage opportunities if we have an imperfect arbitrage. So here also, I just take this as a given. There are some papers provide evidence to show there could be unemployed arbitrage opportunities. So then in response to a change in a decrease in the short rate, then the long rate also will be decreased, right? So here I use the short-term investment as a proxy for the motive to engage in arbitrage transactions. Then for the small firms, it's actually not much difference because they don't have the access to explore those arbitrage opportunities because they can't borrow at a low rate. So the leverage is largely unchanged, and still the business and the R&D should be pretty stable. But for the short-term investment, this is just a savings account. So when the interest rate is low, they choose to decrease their balance, okay? But for large firms, it's different because they can borrow large amount of money at a low cost. So now they see the opportunity to exploit those arbitrage profit. So they will increase their leverage, and they will increase their excess money storage because this money is for the arbitrage transactions. They put there and waiting for the good timing. So this is typical for the transactions in the financial markets. So if this is a case, then that will lead to further up in the risk of premium. Even though you have a lower, a long-term rate, the risk R&D still will go down, and the business actually probably will go up a little. But you think about a business still have a diminishing marginal return, but for the arbitrage opportunities, actually for the single firm, it's constant. It's not diminishing. So you will allocate it more in the short-term investment for the arbitrage, so that we can see a low interest rate actually leads to a lower R&D expending. So let me conclude. So the empirical results shows when the interest rate is higher, then the R&D expenditure tends to be higher. There's a positive relationship, and different size groups in firms, they have a different responses. And these behavior of R&D in firms can be explained by the difference between the long and short investment, financial frictions, and arbitrage opportunities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Zhiyi.
Yeah.
Well, does anybody have any questions or any comments? Well, I just have maybe a simple, plain question. Because the topic of your paper says low interest rates lead to low economic growth.
Yeah.
And what you have explained to us is that low interest rates or high interest rates lead to high R&D expenditure. Is that my understanding?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So
in which case, your analysis here is saying that high R&D expenditures essentially lead to low economic growth also, because you seem to be making a double or roundabout statement. The effect of interest rates on economic growth through the effect of interest rates on R&D expenditures. Am I reading you correctly? Or
actually,
am I getting confused with the whole premise?
So this is two separate relationship. One is between the R&D and interest rate. The other is R&D and long run growth. So the interest rate probably have like a short run effect on the short run economic, especially in the business cycle, have the effect on the growth. But I think in the business cycle and the monetary policy literature, they don't have the effect on the long run economic growth. But here I just take the relationship between the R&D and the economic growth as given by the theory of the endogenous growth theories. So that means like your spending in R&D today could have an effect on the economic development, economic growth in future. But that is just I take it as given, and I've been investigate the first relationship between the interest rate and R&D.
Mike, I see you're raising your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yes.
So I'm supposed to be discussant for this paper. But before that, I want to check about the timing. It seems to me that only 15 minutes is left for the last presentation, which is rather short. So if that's the case, I will share only the main comments with Zhiyi and send him the whole set of comments.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I enjoyed reading this early draft of the paper. For personal reasons, it was not completely finished. And I also enjoyed your presentation here, Zhiyi. You gave a little bit further details that were not in the paper. From the paper, some improvements in explanation would be welcome. And I think that you already did some of it in your presentation. I will skip repeating what you just presented, or what's contribution and what are the findings, and just tell a few things that I really liked about the paper. I think it's real cool that you take firm level data that gives sound micro foundations. You're handling an important question. You're unpacking aggregate results into smaller groups. I think that is excellent. And I also appreciated your attempt at sketching a formal model for explanations. My comments are kind of threefold, and I'll just do them in very broad strokes here in the interest of time. How long is persistently, or how long is long enough? I think that this is an essential question of your paper. You also, for your presentation, highlighted that it is dynamics that is really important in your paper, the distinction between short-run reactions to interest rate and long-term nature of the research proposals. I was wondering, you only include the lagged variables in your aggregate estimation, but I didn't see them in the firm data anywhere. So I thought that perhaps there might be a little bit more to explore in terms of dynamics in your estimation. The second, it has some methodological points. Looking at your regressors, the list is very, very short. I wonder if there might be some other factors that are relevant for determining R&D expenditures for firms. I just mentioned here, like maybe regulatory variables or demand conditions. This last one may be more important because in bad times, demand definitely shrinks, and that might put additional strain on the companies with deciding. A little bit of testing, I think it's probably coming, and you've probably done it. It just didn't manage to get in the paper, the paper yet. Me personally, I would prefer just a little bit more explanation of methodology in your paper also. It seems to me that it would be reasonable to include inflation because it determines the real burden of the debt repayments. I don't know if you possibly already experiment with that, but maybe worth thinking about it. You will probably provide some results for robustness, trying different things there, although you have a little bit because you do different sizes of companies. I was wondering why you chose the federal funds rate. Maybe some other rate would be more appropriate given the long nature of research projects, but yeah. The third comment is more related to the difficulties of acquiring additional debt in bad times. It comes from the fact that first, demand conditions are bad for companies also. Second, that the valuation of the companies will shrink the initial capital because of stock market crashes. There is an issue with the real burden of debt. And finally, also financial intermediaries are not in good shape to extend the credit in bad times. Very nice motivation for the paper and in presentation, in my opinion. There might be various reasons why there is hardly any references in the paper at the moment. I expect it to be a long list there soon. And then I have a bunch of little things that I'm going to send to you, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
Can I just ask one clarification, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know whether you're relating this story to US or any developed country, or which country are you referring this to? Because we keep on
this is based on the data in US.
Okay.
The US.
I would like you to specify that to make it clearer. Yeah. Thank you.
One part
Great,
of the
thanks.
Well, one last point is that I've seen that now a big part of the literature on innovation is moving to the assessment of the intangibles. So there has been a very big increase in the investment of intangibles, and that I believe has a very different impact on R&D. So maybe you want to consider that as well in terms of composition of what has become investment over the last years.
Yeah, that's a good point, because intangible is a kind of like a capitalized expense, R&D expense will change a little bit, but yeah, but it's actually intangibles. It's not just those R&D expenditures. It includes something else. So it's I think more difficult. I will try see if I can get something. Yeah, thank you very much.
Cruzier, check out Cruzier at Northwestern. He's doing a lot of stuff on that. Maybe you can pick up the references.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to comment or ask a question? If nobody else has anything to say, I appreciate you all presenting and listening and commenting on them. And I thank you all for being here. Good luck in whatever you're doing.
Hello, I'm sorry.
Yeah, still one presenter.
My presentation is still to be here.
Sorry?
I haven't presented and I'm ready to go.
Oh.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I mean, I'm looking at it.
Thank you. So I see that I have 9 minutes for my presentation left. I will please.
I have only.
I'm going to try to squeeze it as much as possible. I really didn't expect this. The question is about Latin America. I'm asking what are the determinants of inequality in Latin America? And specifically, I'm asking, is it possible that there is a financial Kuznets curve in Latin America?
Excuse me, can you share your screen?
Oh, I thought I have. Sorry. I apologize. Is it there now? Can you see it?
Yes, yes.
I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So maybe I'll just do it this way. Yeah. So preview of the results. It turns out that financial deepening is worsening the inequality, and there is financial Kuznets curve, which means that this effect initially is making worse the income distribution, and then later it turns out to be improving. Education turns out to be one of the main determinants of downward sloping trend in inequality across Latin American countries, while foreign direct investment and poverty definitely do just the opposite and worsen it. Here is the picture of Gini coefficients for the continent. We see that something must have happened in around 2000, because we see very clear downward trend in almost all the countries. There are two exceptions that I'm not going to have time to talk to, but they are exceptions. The first one is, maybe I should say a thing about this one, is Argentina. This is Argentinian big crisis that ended up in default at the end of 99, almost into 2000. And we could see that after that, the trend turned out very differently. I already specified the research questions, so I'm just going to go very briefly through the factors that I considered. One was GDP growth, and I'm not going to go much into details there. One factor that I did not include at the end is institutional variables. If you have some idea how I could do that, I would appreciate your advice. But they are definitely relevant, especially built on the extractive institutional roots that go back to colonialism in Latin America. There's plenty of literature showing how those are still determining the economy outcomes across the continent. I plan to say quite a bit about poverty and poverty reduction in different countries, but in this 4 minutes, I'll skip it. I'm glad to talk to you individually if you wish to, but there are some interesting experiments with poverty reduction programs that are conditional. If your kids go to school and if you bring them to health checks, then we will give you some money to do something with it. Chile and Mexico both experimented with that. Education, for obvious reasons, because it means additional supply of skilled labor, and fiscal policy through its redistributional effect. Maybe I'll just skip this too, because they are rather obvious. So there are contradictory results about financial deepening in literature. Some say it's becoming worse, some say it's improving. And I think that perhaps the contradiction could be resolved with the Kuznets curve, where we see worse results for a while and then possible improvements later. There are 3 papers that I'm aware on that. Nikolowski and Sahai are doing a big panel over all different countries, and Bayardi and Morana are doing that only for, for Europe. So this is a question that I'm estimating financial development or financial deepening, its squared value, schooling, income, poverty, and bunch of controls there. Financial deepening is private credit in GDP. There were major data issues with Venezuela, Cuba, Argentina, and others, as I think some of you are very well aware of. So I'm not going to go into details there either. Yeah, the endogeneity in the equation is an issue. So I use dynamic panel with at least 3 regressors lagged. So those were instrumental variables. And then I also did GMM with Arellano bond estimation that includes lag dependent variable. What I find, I built here slowly, but I'm going to go quickly to the final result because of the time. So financial deepening turns out to be significant and positive, which means that initially limited access to financial services, difficulties providing collateral for people from a lower spectrum of income, lack of education, tacit knowledge that's not there, inadequate infrastructure harms people from the the poorest people in a way that they cannot take advantage of financial deepening initially. However, the thing changes as the financial system develops further, and we observe that so-called Kuznets curve. Here, there's significant negative coefficient. It turns out that the peak for the estimated countries lies between 60 and 80%. I already mentioned earlier that Central America has increasing middle class, which is more savvy and has higher demand for financial services. So the financial service sector is developing also relatively quickly. The next result, or the next part of the paper, is dedicated to education. It's amazing that education increased on average over 3 years, over last 3 decades. And that would, given my estimates, take 6 percentage points of Gini coefficient. There are dynamic and spillover effects to education. And again, I'm going to skip saying much about those. Both growth and poverty turned out to be significant in terms of indicating worse inequality incomes when they increase. Openness could be seen either way. There's disagreement in literature about this. It seems that my papers, my results suggest that FDI is actually worsening the income distribution because it requires high-skilled labor in general, and it's in general a transfer of technologies. So a little bit on the robustness, I estimated different forms of the equation. Consistently, I have financial development significant both for linear term and the quadratic term. Consistently, education really matters. Consistently, poverty is one of the main factors for bad income distribution. Yes, the crises are also here significant, but were not always significant. Finally, I wish to mention the government expenditures. Government expenditures turned to be significant also, improving the income distribution, while the taxes were not. I found that interesting. So this is a kind of summarizing basically what I already said. The estimates with the different estimation system are consistent with what I said. They are almost the same. Poverty sucks, education is great. There's financial Kuznets curve, and there's relatively high persistence in Gini coefficients for the continent. This is absolutely the shortest version that I could give to keep the time in check. I hope that you'll forgive this brevity. I was pushed into it, and thank you.
That was very good.
Thank you. Thank you. I must apologize for squeezing you into that time, but I'm going to ask Veronica, do we get 5 minutes in case anybody have a comment?
I was supposed to be the discussion, but I think I don't have time. Only thing is like about the modeling question, since there is empirical studies, some studies reflect that financial deepening improves inequality, and other studies actually saying that financial deepening actually worsens inequality. So whether there is a threshold level, like, okay, the countries up to this threshold of the income level are getting worsening, or threshold level impact is either in education or income. And if you include some of the discussions about I might have gotten the earlier version, but if you include some of the discussions about the Gini variable, how you, because annual data is not available, so how you compute whether all the household survey data are using the same technique, and in the GMM estimation, whether you are using the first difference, second difference, or two-level method. So those things need to be mentioned, and some justification of the poverty variable in the regression, because sometimes it might it is little complicated. Like the Gini coefficient can remain unaffected if all the things actually move simultaneously, or how the poverty and Gini coefficient are positively correlated. So those need to be discussed. And in the figure 1, you can just label some of the important countries where so that will help us to read the chart nicely. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Would you be so kind to send me the comments, please?
Yeah, I'll send you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to, in fact, that's a very involving paper. I was wondering whether, did you take in consideration land ownership that can actually be an influence on inequality in that region of the world?
I have not. Maybe it's a good idea. I should actually think about that.
Because
yeah, I should have said in the beginning that it was a very good paper and with a very nice literature review, and the topic is very important because in the Latin American countries, this issue of nexus of growth and inequality is an important issue. Thank you.
Yeah.
Incidentally, I don't have a copy of the paper. That's probably what caused some timing problem here.
Yeah, it was submitted in time, and I also sent it in time to my discussant. So it is on the web for the conference.
No, it's a good paper. Please try to see the land ownership. It's very important in that region of the world. It's very, very important, land ownership.
And this might tackle a question of institutional roots in colonialism, right?
Yes, and institutions too. Institutions seem to promote a lot of inequality in many of the developing countries.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I add another point? Because I was interested in a similar type of literature related to too much finance, right? By Arkan, Berkes, and Panizza, and so on. They find that with basically this financial deepening has this sort of constant curve on growth, right? After a certain threshold, too much finance starts to decrease the rate of growth rather than pushing for development, right? So I was wondering whether what you find has to do with the fact that at some point, too much credit to GDP starts to decrease growth. And therefore it's the whole country that starts to shrink. It's not just the inequality that is affected per se. Like there's an intermediate channel going on, some sort of two-stage.
So would you be so kind as to repeat the name? Berg?
I will write it down. I will write it down in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that actually can be a big problem in developing countries. Maybe too much finances may pose problem in developed economies, but in developing countries, you need a lot of finances in order to carry on the development activities in different sectors.
But I think that depends. Actually, I think it can be worse because it depends on the GDP, on how big is the GDP. So potentially, actually, it takes even more finance to be a problem for advanced economies because their GDP is higher. While with big flows coming from the Western countries to developing countries, it's even easier to reach that threshold early on, exactly because you have these massive capital inflows.
But if the capital come actually to facilitate the movement of capital and the creation of capital and economic activities, I don't think that was the problem. It can come and pose problem if the infrastructure and also the bottleneck in the economy and the infrastructure is not well developed. Infrastructure is not well developed.
We don't have time for that, but it really depends on the type of capital flow. So a capital flow like FDI is very different from hot money like equity shares and bond buying. And to the extent that it only a small fraction of the population is able to have access to this type of capital markets.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem.
Yeah,
if it's small fraction.
It's
what I'm saying, if you make all inclusive, you will not have a problem. There, only a small fraction of the economy is getting access to it.
In a way, it relates to what the fundamental problem relates to what Zhiyi was presenting before. To what extent the capital comes from a long-term investment or from a short-term investment.
Okay.
That's the.
Okay. Thank you so much. Guy, were you going to say something? Was somebody?
No, I'm good.
Huh?
No.
I thought I saw some hands going up and down. I mean, I thank you so much for presenting the papers. I thank you for those of you who are commenting. I think that brings us to the end of the session.